Legion, our chair is not at our meeting today, so I'm going to call our meeting to order to get us started, and I'm going to turn it over to Katie Fitzgerald, who will take us through our agenda. Should be on.
Y'all hear me?
No? Just talk right into it.
Can y'all hear me? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. I'm going to just take this off the stand. Pam normally has a much more eloquent introduction of housekeeping than I do, and I forgot to get that from her before she went on vacation. So I'm going to do my best to remember. So for those, welcome to the August 2023 meeting of the Douglas County Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. For those members who are joining us on Zoom, we would ask that you turn your cameras on. And as when we get to the parts with questions, those folks who are on Zoom, we'd ask to raise your virtual hand so we can call on y'all. Before we get started with our agenda, I wanted to do a brief introduction. We have a new stakeholder to our jurisdiction, Jessica Glendenning, who is the new Chief Public Defender for the BIDS Public Defense Office for Felonies. So she is with us. She is on the agenda, and we'll do a big overview of her office today. But before we started, I wanted to go around and have folks do a brief introduction so that she has a sense of who all is here and can put faces to names before we get started, if that's all right. And she's down at the end by Shay. So Shay, do you want to start and go around?
Wes Levitt, Police Chief, Eudora.
Mike Patrick, Police Chief, Baldwin City.
Shannon Reed, Douglas County Commissioner.
Brad Finkeldye, City Commissioner. Lauren C.
Chastity Schaefer, Peer Support Supervisor with DECA.
I'm Sarah Plinsky. I'm the County Administrator for Douglas County.
Jay Armbruster, the Sheriff, Douglas County.
I'm Nelson Mosley, Chief of Police, University of Kansas.
Chris Kopecki, Lawrence Municipal Court Judge.
Lori Alvarado, CEO at DECA.
And I'm Patrick Schmidt, CEO at Burton Ash. We're the Community Mental Health Center for Douglas County.
And I'm going to call on folks who are online. Carrie.
Yes, Carrie Nice with the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, Reentry Director.
And I have Doris next.
Hello, Doris Ricks, retired community.
Mariel.
Ferredo, community member.
And Chief Lockhart.
Rich Lockhart, Lawrence Police Chief.
Thank you, guys. So we'll hear more from Jessica, but I just wanted to kind of start with that so she's not, so she has a sense of who she's joining the table with. The first item on our agenda is the presentation from Matt Cravens as a update to the 2022 data from the law enforcement contact study. So for folks who were with us last year and over the last several years, we started this project with some researchers from Northeastern, and they completed their project, I believe, last August. And since that time, Matt has worked very closely with those researchers to continue the data analysis and also our law enforcement chiefs. So he is going to present that data from this past year. And that will be the first big agenda item for us this morning.
No.
Hello.
right, there we go. If this suddenly clatters down in the middle, don't be surprised. All right, so welcome everyone. Today's presentation, as Katie mentioned, is going to focus on the 2022 data for all law enforcement stops, pedestrian and traffic stops recorded by the 5 law enforcement agencies of Douglas County. Jack McDivitt and Janice Iwama presented the 2020 and 2021 data. However, because I do some additional calculations that weren't in their presentations, I'll also include several figures with the 2020 to 2021 data just for comparison purposes. But for those of you who haven't seen it, there is a lengthy report with all this data and more, including data going back to 2020 that will be posted shortly after this meeting to the CJCC's meetings webpage. So feel free to download that and look through that if you want any more information. All right, before getting into the data, here are 2 quick updates made to the data collection process that I just wanted to update everyone on. So the survey form that officers fill out after each stop was updated in spring 2023. The race and ethnicity questions stay the same, but there are now new options that officers can check for the reason for stops, like speeding 10 to 14 miles per hour and 15 plus instead of just 10 and under and 10 and over. It also lists new reasons for searches that officers can select, like the odor of drugs and alcohol. We think this is going to give us a lot more good information in the next year's report. Unfortunately, those new options were rolled out in spring 2023, so this current presentation won't include that data, but you will see that later. Also, KUPD transitioned from paper to online data collection in June 2023, which makes the process a little more smooth. And I think that's it. So let's jump in. This figure shows the number of stops by year, month, and agency. Today's presentation will focus on the 9,578 stops recorded in 2022. One quick note, Lawrence PD didn't collect data for about 7 weeks in February and March, so those bars in February and March are going to be a little bit lower. And Eudora PD didn't collect data on all stops in January and February, so those bars will be a little lower in January and February too. All right, so this figure shows the 5 most common bases for stops in 2022. The smaller categories like special detail and warrant are shown in the report, but not here. Overall, we see that stops for equipment and registration together made up 29% of stops in the county, similar to the percentage in 2021 and higher than the percentage in 2020. Common examples of equipment violations include broken taillights and turn signals. Speeding 10 miles per hour and up accounted for 33% of stops in 2022. And as you can see here, the 5 agencies do tend to make different types of stops. So let's see, 57% of sheriff's office stops are for speeding, more than other agencies. Eudora also makes a lot of speeding stops. Lawrence makes a lot of stops for equipment, 22%, and for quote unquote other traffic violations, 31%. One note, other traffic violations are those not specifically listed on the survey form. So there are a wide range of other stops, but they're generally more likely to be sort of lower level, high discretion, sort of less safety related stops. Common examples are headlights turned off, that shows up in the data quite a lot, and failing to use a turn signal. For KU, stop sign and stoplight violations are the most common bases for stops. And then one statistic not shown here that you all may be familiar with is that 96% of all stops are for drivers, only 4% are for pedestrians. So there's a little variation in that by agency. Lawrence PD and KU have the highest percentage of pedestrian stops, but even for those agencies, about 7%. All right, so there is some variation by race and ethnicity in the basis for stops. Jack and Janice didn't break this out, but a lot of traffic stop research currently does this as sort of a standard sort of intro to the basis of stops. This figure shows that the percentage of stops for equipment, registration, and other violations, it shows that those 3 categories, which tend to be a little bit more non-safety, low-level, high-discretion stops, they make up 43% of stops for Asian subjects, 45% of stops for white subjects. They make up larger percentages of stops for Hispanic, Middle Eastern, Black, and Native American subjects. This figure shows that for KU and Lawrence and the Sheriff's Office, the Black drivers in the sample are more likely to have equipment, registration, and other stops. But just note that the only agency that had that Black-white disparity in each of the last 3 years from 2020 onwards was the Sheriff's Office. Right here, I'm showing the 2022 data. So here are the outcomes of stops, and please do stop me if anyone has questions, stop me. No, do jump in if you have any questions and feel free to interrupt. So here are the outcomes of stops in 2022. Baldwin officers gave warnings in 89% of their stops. Lawrence PD officers gave warnings in 62% of their stops, and citations in 27%, and other agencies are in between. Douglas County's citation percentage is much lower than other jurisdictions. For example, Missouri's citation rate in the last year of publicly reported data is 46%. So even Lawrence PD is 20 percentage points lower than Missouri. So there are possible reasons for this. We don't know the reasons, it's not in the data, but it could be that officers and chiefs are nicer here in the county or have a policy of giving more warnings. It's also been pointed out to me that it's possible agencies make more unnecessary stops that aren't ticketable or actionable, but we don't know. It could be a combination of those reasons. So this is the probability of any search in 2022, given that you're pulled over. The figure shows that 7.5% of stops by Lawrence PD resulted in a search in 2022. 2.8% of stops by Eudora PD resulted in a search. These search rates are roughly comparable to agencies elsewhere in the US. So I looked up a bunch of studies. One study of 132 departments across the US found that city police departments have a 6.3% search rate on average. So we're, our city PDs are about on par with that. Roughly. Sheriff's departments across the US have a 3.9% search rate, and miscellaneous and specialized agencies across the US have a 1.1% search rate on average. The total number of searches is displayed in the table. There were 502 searches recorded in the data in 2022. This figure shows that the searches of Black subjects are more likely to have probable cause listed as the reason. So initially we see this as a good reason, less likely to have consent searches. Consent searches occur when an officer who doesn't have evidence for probable cause asks if the subject is willing to submit to a search of their car or person. Generally, we like to see that number be lower. This result could mean either that officers are requesting consent searches less often for Black drivers, or that Black drivers are refusing consent searches at a higher rate. We don't know. These Black-white differences are present for all agencies in 2022 with at least 25 searches. So this figure shows that the percent of discretionary searches where no contraband was found in 2022. So I'll use the term evidence and contraband interchangeably. And one note, discretionary searches are searches other than those incident to arrest and tow. This is how Jack and Janice defined it before. I just sort of use one discretionary category. I think they had an extra discretionary category, but the difference is usually just a 1 or 2 search difference. So I have one discretionary category. At the low end, no contraband was found in 34% of Lawrence PD's discretionary searches. At the low end, Eudora found no contraband in 7% of its discretionary searches in 2022. So this means that Douglas County agencies are finding contraband in the vast majority of discretionary searches. For Eudora, over 90%, and over, about 2/3 for Lawrence. And this is very good news, and I think this really should be celebrated. Our no contraband percentages are lower than many US agencies. So again, I looked at other US agencies, and the Douglas County percentage is 15 percentage points lower than Missouri, 20 percentage points lower than state highway patrols across the US, and about 40 percentage points lower than large US city PDs. The report has more information about this. Any questions? All right, so this section will look at stop rate disparities. An estimated 37% of Black driving age Douglas County residents were stopped between 2020 and 2022. The comparable percentage for whites was 15%. So on the survey form, officers indicate whether the person was a county resident or not. This table shows only the number of resident stops divided by the driving age population in the county in each racial group according to the census. So this 43% midway down means that not accounting for individuals stopped multiple times, 43% of Black Douglas County driving age residents were stopped in these 3 years. There's not really a definitive way to account for people stopped multiple times in the data. To my knowledge, there are no stop surveys that get the identity of people pulled over. However, based on some hypotheses from experts, we can assume that about 15% of stops are repeat stops for the same individuals. So that being said, 37% of Black Douglas County driving age residents have been stopped. Thinking about this number, we did see that COVID was in this period. So, considering COVID significantly reduced the number of stops in 2020, and we're missing 7 weeks of LPD stops in 2022, this rate is pretty high. So I think we can conclude here that a large share of Black drivers in the county haven't stopped, but it is good to compare this number to other jurisdictions just to see how we measure up. One note that regardless of what year we're looking at, the Black to white ratio is always 2.5. So you'll see that 2.5 there in the middle of the table, and under 2022, it's been that way since 2020. So in other words, Black Douglas County residents were 2.5 times more likely to be stopped than white residents relative to their size of the county driving age population. These are ratios from the table in the last slide, just put into a figure. There aren't any disparities for groups other than Black residents. But I do want to say one note in a big study just published last month. Research shows that law enforcement stop data does tend to somewhat underestimate racial disparities for Hispanics relative to whites, because officers sometimes report Hispanic drivers as white, non-Hispanic. We don't know how much this underestimate is for Douglas County, although even if that 0.9 for the Hispanic category were somewhat higher, it would likely not reflect a large disparity. And just note that in all these figures, I put a little bar across that one. One indicates no disparity. Oh, and one other note, Jack McDivitt and Janice Iwama calculated a Black to white ratio of 2.7. I think it was 2.73 instead of 2.5. The report has more information about this. I'm happy to answer questions, but this is mostly because I don't group Hispanics with whites for purposes of benchmarking. I separate those two groups, which I think is good. And I also handle people reporting multiple races more consistently across the census and stop data. All right. So here are the Black-white stop disparities in other jurisdictions across the US. So there are some sources of publicly available data. In the middle bar, we see the 35 US cities in the Stanford Open Policing data displayed here. It's a geographically diverse mix of mid-sized to large cities, multiple years of data with an average of 2.3 million stops per year in multiple years. So we're talking about a very, very large sample size here. The ratio for these cities is 1.5. Meaning that on average, Black drivers are 1.5 times more likely to be pulled over. There is variation among cities, and the report does have a breakout by cities, but we are unfortunately worse than most cities. We're most similar to St. Paul, Minnesota, actually, but then St. Paul's disparity after their data collection got worse, and they instituted some reforms like prioritizing safety stops and moving violations, and then their disparity went down again. So we're not quite like St. Paul anymore, but you'll see maybe if you go to the report that we're close to them. North Carolina also makes their data publicly available, and that's in the bar on the right there. Its Black to white ratio is 2.0. So Douglas County is also worse than that state. I presented the Douglas County data in this figure in the same way as other jurisdictions to make it comparable. So for example, I include county residents and non-residents, just like these other data sets. However, the ratio is always 2.5, no matter whether non-residents are included or what year of data is included. And one note, there's discussions in some places about census data and whether it's an appropriate statistical benchmark, saying it could possibly overstate disparities. Maybe we should use other benchmarks. A lot of recent research is actually showing that Black-white disparities in stop rates are underestimated by about 15% based on census data. So this 15% accounts for differences in access to cars and driving volume by race. Frank Baumgartner, a national expert in traffic stop research, writes that it is well documented that whites typically have greater access to vehicles and tend to drive longer distances than minority drivers. He concludes that census data provide a reasonable but conservative statistical benchmark when calculating disparities. So I don't make any adjustments based on this finding, but it's just good to know that we're not over-reporting disparities here. So I want to jump into two recommendations that stem from this data. They'll also be on the last slide, but I just want to introduce them while they're relevant. So we saw previously that several racial groups are more likely than whites to get pulled over for non-safety and high discretion violations. So one big recommendation is for agencies to prioritize safety stops and moving violations and limit low-level high discretion stops. So a number of studies, a growing number, are finding that this works for reducing disparities, including a 2020 study. So they researched a chief in Fayetteville, North Carolina, who stepped up prioritization of safety stops and moving violations with the goal of reducing crash deaths and racial disparities. So Fayetteville was having just a lot of crash deaths, a lot of injuries. They had very high racial disparities. So this new sort of policy led to fewer investigatory and pretextual stops. It led to fewer crashes. It reduced racial disparities on a couple different measures, and it even appeared to slightly decrease crime in the city using overall non-traffic crime rates. St. Paul, as I mentioned, also found that prioritizing safety stops led to reduced racial disparities without any effect on crime rates. And I do understand there are trade-offs with initiatives like this and reshaping officer discretion, but it is a tool that's worth considering that a lot of jurisdictions are turning to. And also just, from my own standpoint, I imagine that, or public community relations, I would imagine that, a lot of folks would say public safety would be strengthened by focusing on safety stops and moving violations. All right, so another recommendation that I mentioned on the last slide is for chiefs and supervisory staff to review individual officer level stats. Chiefs have a real opportunity here to reduce their disparities through officer level stats. When there are officers who, for instance, are 25% African-American and 40% non-white, or officers searching non-white drivers at 4 and 5 times the rate of whites, those officers might not always be aware of what they're doing. And supervisors simply pointing it out can have a large effect. As I mentioned in the last slide, it is vital, though, that the chiefs and supervisors interpret these stats, because some officers may be assigned to certain enforcement units which affect their stats, which only the chiefs and supervisors will know about that. So any questions before we move to citations? So for the most part, there aren't many disparities in citation rates in Douglas County, with the exception of equipment citations for DGSO. In some categories for Baldwin and Eudora, but there are important caveats about the Baldwin and Eudora findings. This table shows that the probability of a stopped white person being issued a citation is 18%. It is 18% for non-white subjects and 16% for Black subjects. The non-white category does include subjects who are Black and also any race or ethnicity other than non-Hispanic whites. So at the bottom of the table, and basically Jack and Janice only broke out non-white from white, but really the disparities are always larger for the Black category. So I break out the Black category separately from the non-white category. At the bottom of the table. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I know it's long, and I actually looked at the length of it yesterday. So I thought, wow, I'm gonna have to go through it a little quickly, but I will definitely slow it down. All right. So yeah, on the column on the left right here, what we're seeing is that 18% is the probability that you get a citation if you're pulled over and you're white. So that's pretty low. As I mentioned, other jurisdictions are much higher, right? We give citations at a much lower rate. For non-white folks, that's the same, it's 18%. What I was saying is that the non-white group includes everyone who's not white. So Hispanics, Blacks, Middle Eastern, every racial group that's non-white. The thing I do differently than Jack and Janice is I break out the Black groups separately. Now, for most of their report and slides, they didn't do that. I think it's important. That's kind of standard in traffic stop studies these days. Always break out the Black group, because generally disparities are larger for that group. So that being said, the Black group is sort of within that non-white group. So does that make sense? Okay. The Black citation probability is 16% right here. So what we do is we divide 18 by 18 and we get a ratio of 1. So that indicates no disparity whatsoever. And then we divide that 16% by 18% and we get a disparity of 0.9, which is no disparity, actually a slight negative disparity. So generally we look at agency level disparities over 1.5. And there are some caveats. The smaller agencies, data fluctuates more, right? So like a small number of stops different for Black or white or a different category can kind of move the needle more on the smaller agencies, not so much on the larger agencies. So, generally it's good to look at the 2020 and 2021 data next to the 2022 data for the smaller agencies. So I am going to show some of those figures next to each other. But initially here, we don't see a lot. You look at that 1.4 for equipment stops, that looks kind of high, but not too bad. It's not above 1.4, but we kind of want to dig into that a little bit more. So the next slides are going to dig into the agency differences. All right, so here are the overall citation rates relative to white rates. And I focus a lot on this ratio because that's kind of what all the studies do. They just, what's the ratio of Black to white or non-white to white, and if it's about 1, there's no disparity. If it's a little higher, we don't worry too much. If it's a little lower, that's good. If it starts getting above 1.5, we worry. Baldwin's pretty high here, but as I did mention, these are small sample sizes. So we put right next to it the 2020 to 2021 data. Baldwin was a lot lower in the previous year. Eudora went down in 2022. As you see, the larger agencies don't change too much year to year. So, this is just something for I think Eudora and Baldwin to kind of keep an eye on in 2023, but it's also helpful to dig into the type of stop. So what we can do is we can say like, okay, if you were just stopped for equipment and nothing else, like, sometimes officers will list two reasons for a stop. They'll say speeding and equipment or seatbelt and equipment. I'm going to look at just equipment and see if there's a disparity there. So here are the ratios of black to white and non-white to white for equipment. There we go. So let's see, the sheriff's office had a large disparity in 2022. Not shown here, but so 2% of white drivers pulled over for equipment were given a citation by DGSO, and 7% of black drivers pulled over for the same exact thing were given a citation. So we see that the ratio is 3.5, which is large. Jack and Janice found this too, and so this isn't huge news, but it did go up a little bit. So one thing is that they received some statistics on the officers giving out most of these citations, so I think they're going to process that, and we'll see what happens with next year's stats. Hopefully it'll be better, but that is obviously an area to work on. We can also break out stops by just speeding and see if there are disparities there. Eudora's ratio was high in 2020 and 2021, but it did decline in 2022. So, obviously that's something to kind of monitor for that agency. Not a lot of other disparities there. This is the other violation stops. Eudora is a little high here in all years, so that's something for Eudora to work on. But the other 4 agencies actually had ratios below 1 for this category of stops. Now, remember, other is all the sort of smaller, lower level type. They tend to be higher discretion stops that aren't on the form. So a lot of headlights off, seatbelt. There's some no tag light. That's less common, but there's stuff like that. And we actually see a sort of a negative disparity for the other agencies. Now, this could be partially because we saw before, some agencies pull over sort of a disproportionate number of non-white people for other violations. So maybe they're just ticketing them at a lower rate. We don't know, but that's sort of what the data show. I pulled up citation rates for a number of different states that made some data publicly available. So it's a little tricky to compare because every state sort of defines a citation slightly differently. This is in the report. But in general, we see that Douglas County is better than Missouri. Missouri does have a 1.4 disparity in their last year of data. We're similar to California and Massachusetts in not having a broad problem with citation disparities. So, as I mentioned, though, there are some disparities for different categories that agencies can work on. So search rates. I think this is one of the main areas that we saw Jack and Janice highlight before. And we did see this year in 2022 that search disparities have gone down a little bit, but there is some variation by agency, and multiple agencies still have search rate disparities. As we'll see later, search rate disparities are actually the area where a lot of jurisdictions across the US have high numbers. So what this table tells us is that in Douglas County in 2022, a white person has a 2.7% probability of having a discretionary search once they're stopped. And then a black person, once they're stopped, has a 5.9% chance of a discretionary search. So the black to white ratio is 2.2 or 5.9% divided by 2.7%. Hopefully that's clear. If it's not, shake your heads and I can explain. So basically, black individuals are over twice as likely to have a discretionary search after being pulled over. These rates are somewhat lower than 2020 and 2021 when the black ratio was 2.5 and the non-white ratio was 2.0. But in terms of specific agencies, we see the sheriff's office disparities are a little higher than other agencies. Jack and Janice, that's what they pointed out in their years of data as well. Eudora's are much, much higher. Lawrence, KU, and Baldwin's disparities are lower. So let's just put them into a figure so we can see. This is 2022 data. Just note that the Eudora ratios were very high and they go above the displayed y-axis. I couldn't make the y-axis that high. So I suspect that Eudora's extreme disparities may have been slightly influenced by the fact that they didn't collect data on all stops in early 2022 and may have potentially not recorded some searches. small changes in search numbers can really impact Eudora's disparities due to their small overall search count. I think we'll see in another slide, but I think they only had like 15 discretionary searches for the whole year. So, and also we can see that Eudora's numbers were lower in 2021. But, disparities that high are kind of concerning. So it's something to obviously keep an eye on. From the figures, you can also see that the Sheriff's Office, LPD, KU, and Baldwin discretionary search disparities are lower in 2022 than they were in 2020 and 2021. So that's a positive trend. And I think that's obviously something we're celebrating. So we do see disparities above 1.5 still in 2022, though, regardless. And those are, something to work on. So this is a way to sort of visualize search disparities in a different way. So we see that over half of Eudora's discretionary searches are for Black drivers. That stat is 25% for the Sheriff's Office and 21% for Lawrence. By comparison, 5% of the Douglas County driving age population is Black. The percentage is more like 7% for Lawrence. So it does vary a little bit by city. Here are the ratios of search rates relative to the driving age population using the census. So Black Douglas County driving age residents were 4.8 times more likely to be searched than white residents, given their size of the population. The ratio is similar for discretionary searches, 5.1. And then here are the search rate ratios for Douglas County, 132 mixed U.S. agencies using a recent study. All U.S. state highway patrols in, I believe it's 16 states, U.S. large city PDs for the select cities that had search rate data. So we see here Nashville, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Plano, San Diego, San Francisco. That's the sort of the smallest group of all of them. And then Missouri. So a lot of these samples are very large, 4.9 million stops, for example, in Missouri, 3.5 million stops per year in state highway patrols, and they have multiple years of data. It's actually 21 states for highway patrol. And what we see here in the bars is that Black drivers are basically over twice as likely to be searched as white drivers in these jurisdictions other than Missouri, and sometimes 2.5 times as likely. So, I think this is useful to know, but sort of one important caveat when I put this together, I think, just because other areas do have search disparities doesn't mean that we shouldn't work on ours. Maybe that's obvious, but sometimes I think there's the tendency to say that just because there's disparities in a lot of places means we should throw up our hands and say that's it. But it is something that we can make progress on. As we saw, what was promising is our disparities in search rates did go down this year. So there is, reforms have been shown to change these numbers. All right, any questions before contraband? All right, contraband hit rates the disparities are generally low in this area. So I only show data with a large enough sample size to report reliably. And for the smaller agencies, we don't see numbers. But basically, we see overall in Douglas County, the probability of an officer failing to find contraband during a discretionary search is about 27% for a white driver, 33% for non-white subjects, 29% for Black subjects. So when you do the math, the non-white ratio is 1.2, indicating just a minor disparity. The Black ratio is 1.1. Here in the figures, we see that it does depend a little bit on the agency. The ratios have gone up slightly in 2022, but are still quite low, which is good. However, the Sheriff's Office does have a disparity of 1.5 for non-white subjects, which means that officers are more likely to fail to find contraband for non-white subjects. All right, so here are Douglas County put up next to a few other jurisdictions. What we see is it's similar to other jurisdictions and not usually finding a disparity. So recommendations, based on the data, I've generated 5 recommendations. Several of these expand on recommendations by Doctors McDivitt and Awama, exactly. And some are a little new, but the gist is, well, let's just start with data collection. So basically, I urge all agencies to conduct internal checks at the end of each month using their own records. KUPD does this, and they compare their stop data against their own internal records at the end of each month. And they have a sergeant who does this. He does a great job with it. He finds out about stops that, didn't get recorded, or if there were errors, or, someone just leaves their name off, or they write the wrong address or something like that. And they look it up based on their own number of searches that they see, and then fix anything before I download it. So that's great. And I think data quality is a good thing to do. So the next recommendation is to ensure that surveys are always completed. We know that Eudora PD had 2 or possibly more months of inconsistent data collection in 2022. And in general, there are times when officers get busy and forget to fill out a survey, especially if there's like an arrest during a stop. You're busy. I get it. And, let's just have officers fill them out when they remember. Some of the numbers look like there were obviously months that might have been undercounted slightly. We don't want incomplete data collection that might make disparities look worse than they actually are. And I suspect that happened a little bit with Eudora this year. So basically, good data collection is good for making sure the conclusions are accurate. Most of these issues are inadvertent. But, in the future, if data or officer level stats ever start getting used more frequently, there may be incentives for officers to not report certain stops or searches for racial groups. I mentioned this only because last month we discovered that this was happening in Connecticut, where minority stops were underreported for several years, about 25,000 stops. And this would almost certainly not happen here, but it's all to say that, chiefs can help avoid this and other data collection issues by reminding officers to always fill out surveys and conducting monthly data quality checks. All right, so review officer level statistics is number 2. I mentioned this earlier, and Jack and Janice have as well, but agencies have a real opportunity to reduce their disparities through officer level stats. For example, the sheriff's office black-white ratio for discretionary searches would be about 1/3 lower if a handful of deputies with the largest disparities eliminated those disparities. Some of the agencies appear to be working with, or at least have received, officer level stats, so this is good. And this is just a really important reminder that disparity does not necessarily equal discrimination. So for some officers, disparities can be explained by which enforcement units they're assigned to. A common example is if an officer is part of a canine unit, then he'll have higher search rates. And then if he's called to search a large share of non-white drivers, even if he has non-biased behavior, his disparities will look high, right? And this is only information that the chiefs and the supervisors can know. So these kind of individual level stats really need to be interpreted by the chiefs and the supervisors to know if it's at all even relevant. So yeah.
I have a question about what you just said, and I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. So that officer specific levels may not indicate discrimination, but if he's being called to multiple stops for non-white drivers, do we not still have an issue of discrimination somewhere?
Yeah, and I think that would be a more systemic issue. I was actually going to say here that there are also instances where, if officers are more likely to pull over certain types of cars, which happen to be used by non-white drivers at a higher rate, or they're likely to patrol certain neighborhoods which are disproportionately non-white, that can also lead to disparities, perhaps in the way that you're talking about, and can be addressed. And so I think there are ways of dealing with them. And even if it's systematic, we should still deal with them. So yeah, I mean, in some sense, the difference between individual and systemic level discrimination isn't as relevant, but I think you make a good point. So, and I think additional training could be used in certain situations. So for example, experienced officers with high contraband hit rates can help training for officers with low hit rates. And these officer level stats can really help inform the conversation, because we can say, like, if Officer Joe Smo had a really low contraband hit rate for, non-white officers, that's something we can work on, and so that's an area for help in the future. Any other questions?
So going back to what Shay was saying in terms of so let's say Officer K9 gets called a lot to do searches. So Officer K9 gets recorded as the officer searching. What data, I guess this is where the department level is looking at that data for the officer who requested that and seeing what their level of search request is, even if they're not, I mean, maybe it's tracked, or maybe it's not, but maybe that's what needs to happen. So you can tell whether Officer X is the one who calls a lot for those searches. Is there a way to suss that out?
Now, I don't have data on that, but I think that's something that, chiefs and supervisory staff may know. I don't know if they collect data on that systematically or not, but I think that would be helpful if they did. Let's see. And we do have a. Yes, that's a good point, Doris. And there's one last recommendation, number 5, that deals with that. And I think, some studies have also found that where officers choose to patrol or where they're assigned to patrol does influence disparities too. So that's, something to look at as well. So the third recommendation is to prioritize safety stops and moving violations and limit low-level high discretion stops. I mean, when you read the search studies now, a lot of them put this in as a key recommendation. And we saw this here too, that minority stops rates are higher in Douglas County, especially compared to other jurisdictions, and that Black drivers are more likely to have these non-safety high discretion stops in Douglas County. So one solution that I mentioned that others routinely mention is for agencies to just prioritize safety stops and moving violations more. Analysis of North Carolina and Minnesota, as I mentioned, has found that this works without any negative effects on crime rates. So that is a tool in the toolbox. Number 4 is search rates. So this is a tricky issue because we want to ensure that officers are applying the same standards for searches to all drivers. And right now in the county, officers are over twice as likely to search a Black driver as a white driver once they're stopped. And they find contraband at a similar or slightly lower rate for Black drivers. So there have been studies on this too. And, recent studies using rigorous methods and very large sample sizes have found that officers often apply a lower sort of psychological threshold when deciding whether to search drivers of color relative to white drivers. They do a lot of different statistical tests to determine this. This doesn't necessarily mean that officers are always sort of wrongly searching non-white drivers, but rather that they sometimes choose not to search similar white drivers when they're sort of on the defense about those white drivers. Likewise, they may search non-white drivers who they're sort of ambivalent about searching somewhat more often than similar white drivers. So these types of effects are likely to be implicit or subconscious in most situations. There may be explicit bias for a few officers here and there, but my guess is that implicit bias drives most jurisdictions' search disparities that we saw in the data. As solutions, agencies can develop checks and procedures to ensure that officers apply the same standards in all search decisions. As I mentioned, they can also provide additional training to officers with low contraband hit rates, especially for certain groups. And review videos of select searches, which I know some agencies do. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. So that's a positive thing. And then next year, we'll know more about searches due to the additional survey response categories on the new form. So odor of alcohol and drugs, for instance, will probably tell us some information. And then finally, agencies should consider not citing drivers for equipment violations. So officers rarely give citations for equipment like broken taillights. They make a lot of stops for it, but they only give citations for like broken taillights and broken turn signals. About 7.5% of times they stop someone for that. So some people do get tickets for equipment, and the sheriff's office has racial disparities in that area. So one solution that Drs. McDivitt and Owama mentioned is to give out free repair vouchers, and Doris mentioned this too, such as lights on vouchers to drivers with these violations. Some other jurisdictions have done this, including Wichita in 2020, and so that's a real solution. I think an initiative like this has the real potential to be visible and sort of strengthen community relations. And I know there's some discussions about that, so that would be a positive thing if that happened. And that is it for recommendations. There are now a few updates from agencies that I would like to give as well, but if there's any questions, yeah.
So Matt, is there any data on Kansas cities like Topeka and Kansas City? Because, here we are in the middle between these two big urban areas. Is there, you've highlighted a lot of other, looks like cities, or you've lumped in, you talked about 135 other cities, but is there any data that we can compare with in Kansas?
That's a great question. I know Wichita does make a lot of their data available. I haven't delved into it and I haven't been able to download it and analyze it, but I could do that for you all at some point.
I think that would be helpful. Topeka does not, yeah.
Yeah, Wichita has done some interesting stuff. Like I mentioned, their Lights On program they've done, and So I believe I could get their data, and I can bring that to you all at some point.
I have two questions. One, maybe for some context, why was there a gap in data collection for the two departments? Was it technology, a switch over, something that might help us and the public understand why it wasn't collected? And then I'm trying to understand a registration. Is that if obviously on the outside, my tab is expired, is that what would require? I wondered about that. And then as I sat, I thought maybe that was what would be a clear indication that there's a registration issue. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the agencies would probably be able to answer those questions better than me on both the. So I think the first question was the gaps in data collection. Yeah, LPD did.
I know
7
part
weeks.
of our gap was, once Janice and Jack were done, there was a miscommunication within our department for a few months that we were done. And until I caught that, that's where the gap was right there.
And that was
It's had to be critical because we just did a software change and our data collection right now is not as great as it normally is. So that's what made me think.
And it was the same thing for Lawrence. We thought the study was done and data collection was done, and then we were made aware that we were supposed to continue collecting, so we did.
In terms of registration, I don't know how registration stops work. To be honest, I assume that's same.
Chief
Oh, go
Patrick,
ahead.
he basically nodded that as I thought about it more, obviously a registration issue would show up on the outside of my car if my tab is expired. I just couldn't understand it at first. And then as I
Right,
thought
was
about it,
just
that's
trying to
obvious.
Clarify that with a nod, not thinking that it's not for the folks that aren't watching. Yeah, for us, it's easy. The state color codes the dates, which is easy for us to try to see from a distance. But if it doesn't appear that it's in the correct year, we do a registration stop to try to find out if they're currently registered and have current insurance, things like that.
In terms of agency practice changes, the stop report by Jack and Janice was released last year, and agencies have made several practice changes since then. So the first, and this isn't an exhaustive list, as these are some key ones. So afterwards, if chiefs have additional ones they want to mention, you certainly can. This is not exhaustive. Some agencies are now retaining body cam footage of stops for longer periods of time. Supervisory staff are reviewing footage of some stops with officers to provide feedback. It's my understanding in number 2 that agency command staff are having initial discussions about the stop data, including some discussions with supervisors with the goal of institutionalizing review and use of this data. 3, if an officer finds no contraband, at least one agency is now asking officers to provide additional context for those searches, so they sort of know, why they didn't yield anything. KUPD, as I mentioned, has implemented data quality control practices to ensure that the data submitted is accurate and complete. That's great. It makes my life a lot easier. Baldwin will also be switching to the county's data collection infrastructure here coming up soon, which will make data quality checks much easier. And again, if I missed anything, chiefs, you can feel free to add anything. And then afterwards, we can open it up if anyone has any other questions.
Anybody have any questions for Matt or for the group? Shay.
I don't actually have any questions. I do have a couple comments. And what I wanted to say is first, I think it's great that all of the agencies are willing to provide this information. It's important that everybody understands what the issues are and that we are actively trying to solve it. So you don't have the issues like you've had with other stop search studies where they're just lying about the people that they're stopping, or they're not putting that information in. I think it's important that we continue to do it. That said, I'm going to be introducing 3 new drivers, 3 Black kids who are going to be driving around town, and it has nothing to do with the race. They can't drive. I'm telling you now, be wary. But the fact that they are 2.5 times more likely to be stopped, and then even more likely to be searched after that. I just want everybody to recognize what a lasting impact that has on brown children and their interactions with law enforcement. So if we can do something to stop that, Or at least try to limit that, the discretionary things. And I tend to like to believe that there are implicit things that are going on there, not explicit racism. I think it is going to be a lot more nuanced than that. But if we can maintain this as a focus as a community, I think it's very important. I think you pointed out that it's similar along states everywhere. That actually, and I think you said maybe it was an encouraging thing. I will tell you, for brown people, that's not encouraging at all. It's quite the opposite. So knowing that it would be different here in my hometown, I think goes a lot further. And if we can do it on a smaller scale in the city or city of Baldwin, you know, wherever, I think that that would be useful. But I didn't want everyone to leave this conversation discouraged, because I know it can get that way pretty quickly when we're talking about race.
No, I think it's a good point that the numbers are numbers, but they represent real folks. And so that 2.5 number that I showed for us, the part of the reason I want to look up other jurisdictions is to see where we are. And no, I thought everyone having search disparity is supposed to discouraging actually. And I think we should, you know, not just throw up our hands and say it's always going to exist, but that 2.5 for stop rates is actually very different than other jurisdictions. So we're having a higher stop rate disparity than a lot of jurisdictions.
This is Commissioner Reed, and I thank you for that comment, Shay, and I want to appreciate that there are differences to be spoken about in terms of implicit and explicit bias, disproportionate impact and explicit discrimination. And I think those things are important to keep talking about clearly and within each agency and department to talk about, because we need to address both things, right? It's not, I don't want us as a community to be talking about disproportionate numbers in just broad terms that assume most of it is implicit and not purposeful, because we have to talk about when it is explicit and when it is purposeful discrimination and prejudice in action in order to address that, while also looking systemically at what some of those other nuanced factors are that are contributing to the numbers more broadly. So I'm hopeful. I also really appreciate that agencies have continued to collect this data. And I think over time is what will show us if and where we're making improvements and making meaningful changes and able to tell stories about that, both on a community-wide level and all the departments working together in this continued data collection, but also, you know, I really appreciate recommendations that are specific to the agency level and agencies talking internally about the whole spectrum of what's going on, both from a policy and practice level, you know, those nuanced conversations about who's giving the direction to certain officers to make certain stops or searches, to unpack that in order to identify when explicit bias and explicit discrimination is occurring.
All right, can I just add this? I think from the impact purpose standpoint, it doesn't matter if it's implicit or explicit. I think the answers can be different on how we solve it. But from the person who got stopped, whether it's the K-9 officer who made that discretionary decision or someone else, it doesn't matter. It's still discrimination. And that's why when the comments are up there that it doesn't necessarily mean discrimination, I think that's why I'm alerted to them, because some people can disregard then so many things when they see that. And that's from my standpoint, and I'm just speaking about me directly, I don't think that that's accurate. If it's discrimination, it's discrimination, regardless of whether it's that officer or the system itself, period. The impact to my children, which is what I'm most concerned about, is the same. So thank you for your comments. I think we're all on the same page here, but I just am encouraged that we're at least looking at it and trying to make some active decisions about how to correct it.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point. The outcomes matter a lot.
There's no other questions. We can move on to the next part of our agenda. And Chief Cabria, if we can make you room at the table, if you want to come join us.
I have a comment. I'll speak up.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that.
Just like sitting in the jury box back.
He likes being on the other side of the fence, right? You're right.
The next part of our agenda was an introduction to the new bids office and a more formal introduction to our new Chief Public Defender, Jessica Glendenning. Do you want to come up here? And Jessica is going to provide an overview of her and her role and office and all sorts of information that I think we've been kind of chomping at the bit to hear about.
Thank you guys for having me today. I'm Jessica Glendenning. I'm going to be the Chief Public Defender here in Douglas County. I have been the Chief Public Defender in Shawnee County in our 3rd Judicial District office. I also previously worked as one of the panel attorneys here in Douglas County and also in the Johnson County Public Defender's Office. So I've had experience across several different jurisdictions. We'll be opening our office in September, but doing training for the entire month of September with our staff and our attorneys. We will have 6 attorneys in that office to start with, including myself. So 5 additional attorneys, 1 deputy, and then 4 other attorneys. We will start taking cases in September. So we expect to be, October. So we expect to be starting taking cases in October. For those who aren't familiar with the state public defender system, it's a little bit different than the panel attorneys in that we have one office who is sort of the first stop for appointed cases. So our office gets sort of notified about first appearances. We look through them, check to see if there's conflicts, and if we're available to take that case, our office gets appointed. If for some reason there's conflicts or other issues, it can still go out to panel attorneys who are on the felony panel. Our office will only take felony cases. We don't do misdemeanors. Those are still handled through the misdemeanor panel. We expect to be present at first appearances to help represent clients at first appearances. And then we stay on the case until the end of the case. It'll be assigned to a specific attorney within the office, and we tend to keep clients specific to one attorney. We're not necessarily interchangeable, although we cover for each other when we can. I'm trying to think, what else do you have questions about? I know that there's already a system in place with panel attorneys. It's really not terribly different, other than we have one cohesive office that takes a bulk of the cases that come through.
How many attorneys will you have?
We'll have 6 to start with.
This may be a systemic question, but if, I know, say, a certain person is arrested and on a fresh charge and brought to first appearance, and they've been represented by somebody in the past, that is typically, that person is reassigned. If I've been arrested and Jim McKeebria was my defense attorney, but I've been arrested on a new case, your office is now in play. Will you then take over those, or will I still remain with the previous attorney? Really, that's more curiosity on my part than anything. So.
I would say, and this is something that we probably need to have a discussion about. In other jurisdictions I've been in, if there's an active case with another attorney, the new case still goes to that same attorney so that we're not splitting. But if it's a closed case that's already passed, then it would come to our office. But that's actually not a discussion I've had yet with the judges. So I'm not exactly certain how that will shake out here. And now you're on the spot.
What we know for sure is you don't want Jim McCabe for your defense. But what she said is the practice we follow. If an active case is out there and it's a panel attorney, that's going to go. If that's all said and done, then new counsel will come in.
Follow-up question to that. If somebody is arrested on multiple charges, 1 felony, 2 misdemeanors, and they don't have any previous or current active charges, well, Do you represent any misdemeanor cases if there's a felony that they're tracking with, or will you always work with misdemeanor counsel and basically like a co-counsel situation?
If the misdemeanor charges are part of the felony case, so it's all in one case, we would handle that. Generally, if there's a misdemeanor case that's a separate case, we coordinate with the misdemeanor counsel if there's, say, going to be a global plea agreement or something like that.
Got it. Thank you.
How does this work with what is the holistic public defenders? They're only misdemeanors. Okay, that's why I went to double check my thinking. Thank you.
There's a caveat. We have to think through, because KHD is qualified to take some felonies, and there's been times when it made sense, since we have a panel system now, to appoint KHD on those felony cases for that continuity. I think we'll have to have some discussions about how that interface will work best. Bids.
When you say that you're going to stay on a case through the conclusion, is that through probation?
Yes. So one of the things that I appreciate about public defenders' offices as opposed to private panel is we stay on the case. We don't withdraw after sentencing. So if someone comes back on a probation violation, or even when they're on probation, they'll frequently reach out to us with issues on probation. Sometimes we work with the probation officers to try and resolve issues and talk to clients about things that are going on about probation. We also tend to have a lot of contact with our clients even after that. So I've helped clients with expungements years later. I've sent people discovery years down the road. We tend to stay in contact. We communicate with them when they're in KDOC sometimes. So we have kind of a longer term relationship.
Other questions? Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, our next agenda item, Katie's going to give us an update on the National Network of Criminal Justice Coordinating Councils annual meeting and the Justice Management Institute proposal.
While I'm getting my slides ready, Jessica, I don't know did you mention where your office is going to be? Did you?
1040 New Hampshire building. So it's going into that old church across the street from the courthouse.
Okay, I'm going to try to get through this shortly or kind of quickly. I feel like this might not be maybe the most meaty or interesting. So I think as some of y'all may remember, last fall, I had asked this council if I could apply to the Justice Management Institute's National Network of Criminal Justice Coordinating Councils. They had opened up applications to take new jurisdictions for the first time in about 12 years. And so we applied and were selected. And so part of what I feel like that might not be a thing that people remember, that we are part of this network. And most of the time for a lot of our CJCC members that might not, y'all may never kind of interact with that. But this network was convened by JMI back in 2010 to bring together a forum for folks in my position as coordinators of CJCCs to kind of learn from each other, help build capacity for system improvement by creating this kind of peer learning network. And the goal of, they have a lot of really good information on their website. I'm happy to, I could probably talk an entire day on this, but one of the goals for them is to try to help jurisdictions create high functioning and high performing groups like CJCCs. These types of coordinating councils are kind of different. We bring together lots of stakeholders that none of us, if we look around the table, gets to tell the other agency what to do. right? But we all are coming to the table because we're all working with the same folks on the same issues, and how do groups like this perform well? And so that's a lot of what is at the heart of this network. So we applied and were selected last fall. We were one of, I think, 10 new sites that were selected. And every year, JMI hosts an annual meeting for the coordinators in the network. And I will swear that I went to Minneapolis. I do not know why I think I went to Minneapolis, right? But I went to Milwaukee. That was who hosted this. And even as I typed these slides, I put Minneapolis and I went, I don't think I went to Minneapolis. No. But Milwaukee, the county of Milwaukee hosted, their CJCC was the host for this year's annual meeting, which was the middle of June. So I wanted to share, I feel an obligation to be sure when I kind of travel on behalf of this group that I want to be sure I share with you all kind of what came out of that. And attached to this is a proposal I would like to run by you all for some continued work with JMI. So when these host sites, one of the maybe benefits of getting to be selected as a host site is a lot of their local programs are highlighted and shared. And Milwaukee has done a lot of work in this space, and they had a lot of really cool programs. The violence response program was really interesting. They have a public health and safety team that has started really trying to tackle gun violence in Milwaukee as a public health issue. And it was a really interesting collaboration between their medical school, their fire, med, and police, first responders, and some of their community groups that are really embedded in communities that are particularly impacted by gun violence. Their community prosecution program was also really good. We spent a lot of time, I feel like, with their DA's office throughout these couple of days. So they have a really broad community prosecution program where ADAs are kind of assigned to particular communities, and they get to know a lot of kind of what's happening there. And as I'm sharing a lot of these programs, recognizing that we are not Milwaukee, but in some of these, not necessarily suggesting that they are things for us to take on, but just sharing some of the things that they shared with us. I most enjoyed our trip to the Sojourner Family Peace Center. If you're ever in Milwaukee, this was an amazing place. It was moving, like, it kind of chokes me up. It was just a moving environment to be in. It is based on the Family Justice Center model, but it is, they very intentionally call it the Family Peace Center because that is their goal, is peace for their families, peace for the survivors, and peace for children who are impacted by domestic and sexual assault violence. Aside from providing the very traditional kind of domestic violence intervention services, part of their sheltering program is there, but they also have, at the time we were there, they have about 14 different community agencies that are co-located in this building, some of which are not the traditional kind of domestic violence services. When we were there just before we got there that week, they had a local doula and kind of maternal health agency that was just moving in to take place there. They also have some of their special victims teams between their police department and their DAs who are also co-located in that building. One of the things, if you're ever there, that was real, their building is decorated with mosaics that the families during the weekly family nights built. And so they would say, like one of the mosaics was, what does family mean to you? And they were given like the ceramic tile things, and they built this mosaic about family. And anyways, it's a beautiful center. It was amazing. Another part of the, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about these, but in addition to kind of the local site, the host site sharing some of their programs, Other sites in the network were asked to share about different programs that they have. These were three that the reentry program was from Mecklenburg County. The Community Restorative Court is a fairly new program that Dane County, Wisconsin has started, targeting youthful offenders who are charged with, as they're in the adult system, but they're still young teenagers charged with misdemeanors. It's based on a restorative justice model. And then the Warrant Forgiveness Clinic, which I was really interested in. This was a program that Adams and Broomfield County, Colorado, operated not as a warrant, not as an amnesty day, but as an opportunity for folks who have outstanding warrants to seek resolution. Is there a plug for this computer? I might lose this. No, the computer. And we'll see how far we can get with this while I'm messing with this. But the goal here was to create an opportunity for folks who have an active warrant to have that resolved. With most of the time it resulted in getting rescheduled, but the goal was to minimize the potential impact of that warrant being served, not just on the jail population, but for our law enforcement folks, to minimize the potential adverse impacts that can come from serving an active warrant. Most of the folks that when they looked at their data, they were traffic warrants, they were outstanding warrants for failure to appear on traffic cases. And the resolution was most of the time just rescheduling. But anyways, I have a bunch of information on that if at some point we ever wanted to do that. But those were kind of the initial key components. The big chunk of what for this particular network meeting was shortly before, about a month before we met in Milwaukee, JMI produced or released their national standards for CJCCs and the essential elements of CJCCs documents. So we spent a lot of time walking through these. The standards, there are 13 standards. I'm not going to read all those to y'all. There are 10 essential elements that are kind of the core components that when present would indicate high performance in the various elements. The key factors are the components of those elements. And then they also released an assessment tool to help walk CJCCs through identifying what is present, where are the opportunities for improving or strengthening local councils. And all of these obviously come with the caveat that while these are best practice and model, not all of these are feasible all the time for everybody in the perfect sense, but the idea would be that councils are implementing and working towards these as best they can. So the 13 standards are those. They're on your screen. I don't want to share a ton of information about all of these, but the standards kind of provide a framework for kind of the ongoing management of CJCCs. So these reflect model CJCCs. Rolled up into these are the essential elements. And these will all be in the slides that I'll send out to y'all after this meeting, but, and then this assessment tool. So this assessment tool was used to identify areas for improvement and also areas where we're kind of where we have strengths and are aligned with these. The rating systems for these are not like, yes, no, you have it, you don't. It's on a continuum based on how compliant is the group in some of these. One of the goals or one of the discussions at the network meeting was that JMI is making themselves available to some jurisdictions to provide this assessment. And so to come in and work with CJCCs to go through this assessment process and provide recommendations. And and support around some of implementing some of the recommendations. So I had asked the two staff from JMI who really lead the network, Tom Eberly and Amy Wickman, for a proposal of what this would look like. We received that a month or a week and a half ago, I think. It's broken out into a couple of phases. They're looking at they proposed about 7 months to work through, kind of from a kickoff meeting with all of you through interviewing. They have an anonymous survey that they would send out, and then they would schedule individual interviews with all of our CJCC members. They would do lots of observations and review and kind of combine all of that and come back to us and say, here's where you're doing well, here's where there's opportunities for growth, and here are some of our recommendations to reach those. And then there are around structural recommendations. They can provide some limited technical assistance there. So those would be things like adjusting and updating bylaws, working through mission or vision statements. And there was one other one that they included in that if that was a thing that we needed. So I would like to, I think on the county side, I'll say I would like to work with them. I think this is a really good opportunity while they have time and capacity and are taking CJCCs to work with. This is a really intensive process. So I would like to continue with this and wondering if there's opposition. I feel like I want to say seeing none. But I don't know if folks have questions about some of this is the end of my presentation here, but.
This is Commissioner Reed, and I will just say I'm very excited about the opportunity for some outside expertise to give us some feedback and observations and direction about how this group is functioning structurally. You know, this CJCC is really just had one iteration so far. We've had a little bit of discussion in recent meetings earlier this year and last year, and certainly amongst us at the county about, you know, taking a look at our bylaws, reflecting back on what has been productive and efficient and effective about this group's work over time with the sort of first strategic plan that was set out by the original CJCC members, and how well did that work or not, and what are some opportunities to give this group a little bit more teeth and purpose, and for everybody to feel like it's action oriented, I think, is feedback that I hear from lots of folks in individual conversations. So I'm excited about it. I think my biggest question about it, Katie, and I don't know if you know this yet, because I know it's very fresh news that we were selected for this opportunity, but that 7-month timeline, does that assume that CJCC is meeting monthly, or would that timeline be stretched out at all now that we are in a bi-monthly or every other month?
So one of the things, most CJCCs actually do, the full council meets every other month. But JMI staff have been out of the office at alternate weeks since we got that proposal, and I reached back out to them about that. So that is one of the questions that that I do not have an answer yet to. Suzanne.
So if I remember correctly, a couple years ago, we were planning a retreat. I mean, I think the idea was, and it ended up kind of not happening for lots of reasons. Our previous director or executive, had moved on another job. But the idea, I think, was that we assess kind of from the top down, starting with bylaws, which are fairly, I read them again, and I think they need to be reviewed. Plus, we've got clear stakeholders now with the defense, with an organizational defense, both on federal and excuse me, felony and misdemeanor that I think should be brought to the table. So if this is a way of kind of doing that, which was intended a couple years ago, I think it'd be great. And I don't know if the retreat's part of that, if we move that up. I mean, I don't know, but these are just things that come to mind as you're talking about what could be helpful with this assessment.
Yeah, they, JMI I think is fairly flexible in how much right now they have capacity to, I think, be kind of as much here, boots on the ground or virtual. However, our budget allows. There is one, in their current proposal, there is one site visit that they do plan, and then would link other activities or other things that we needed or wanted around that. A lot of their initial, a lot of that kind of pre-work during that first assessment phase is going to be virtual, with interviews with you all, I assume, are going to be Zoom. They have 3 staff who are assigned to this project: Tom, Amy, and then Christy Danford, who was she is a powerhouse with CJCCs. I've worked with her years ago in Charleston. And she's kind of, she's amazing in this space. So there's a lot of like virtual kind of pre-work. And then on the back end of that, whatever I think works best for us, or what the desires of this group are around facilitation. I think that can be determined later. One of the things that I have not heard confirmation from them yet, if this group is okay with pursuing this, we were going to, I was going to ask them if that September meeting for this group would be an appropriate time, like if they would be available to kind of join and have that be kind of serve as their introduction, kind of kick off to here's what this process looks like, facilitate introductions between us and them and move from there. But
I appreciate those comments, and I think it'd be really good to have some of these have their investment and time before we get too far down the road on bylaws, to just sort of make sure we are following best practices. But we definitely know we need to work on our bylaws. So I think the timing is perfect here to get them on board and get them started.
And Tom at least is aware that because that bylaws is one of the things that potentially that I thought that this group might be interested in, some additional support around that. So that is, I think that's on their radar of like here an ask of that we would have at the end of this. See, Lori and Patrick.
I think to follow up on the concept of the retreat, I would be interested in them talking to us about where does that make the most sense? If we're going to invest, a day or 2 in the work, does it make sense early? Does it make sense later? I just know how schedules are for this group, which means we should schedule like now if we want to get together anytime between now and I don't know, July of next year. I just know that's a challenge. So that, and then the other thing that I'm wondering about is, what would the product be at the end? I mean, what are they? I think about work groups. I think about work plans. I think we've maybe as an organization stalled out on the work versus hearing the data and knowing there are challenges, but how do we address those challenges? So I'd be interested, and not today, but like, what would the product be? What would be the work of this group afterwards? What are they going to help us with? Those kinds of things so that we can move through that.
I can ask them to have they've done this with a couple, as they were developing these standards. There were a couple of jurisdictions. The one jurisdiction that I've seen most of their work in the space is Coconino County, Arizona. And they had a lot of, they have a lot of examples of what does this look like at the end. And so I can make a note for whenever they join us to be sure that they talk about that and share this. And I don't mean, did you okay, you're good. Okay. Patrick, did you have something else?
No, nothing specific. I was just going to lend my support for this.
Okay. I don't see or hear any big opposition. So I can continue. I will keep y'all posted. I'm going to aim for September. to have them kind of be part of helping us kick this off, especially if we're looking at a fairly lengthy kind of time for this.
There are no other questions for Katie. I want to keep us moving because we're getting close to the end of our time.
I had one update about work groups I want to share. So our failure to appear work group had their first meeting last week. And between the failure to appear and the probation violation work group, unpacking a lot of the data, that's kind of in the spot where we're at. We're trying to figure out what is all the data we have? What are the questions that we want to work through and try to answer? And how do we do that? A lot of our data is particularly in this space, is a little challenging. It's not court and jail data are not necessarily always speaking the same language. And we want to be sure that these work groups are trying to be really intentional about making sure that we're clear on what our data looks like and what it's telling us before we kind of jump into the policy practice evaluation changes. I do think, depending on time, I think we will target, in my head, this might be too soon, but I'm kind of thinking maybe November, like the November-ish meeting. I would look for a more in-depth update about kind of what we've been able to discern from all of that data. A couple things on open discussions. I think that's next, right? I'm going to put Judge Kopecki on the spot and ask him to share a couple of things. I do have the flyer if you want me to share your flyer. There were two things around municipal court that I wanted to offer Judge Kopecki a couple of minutes to kind of talk about.
All right, this is going to be quick since we're really getting right up against the time. I just briefly, we did have a new court initiative that's been catching a little bit of attention about donating school supplies and then getting money off your fines. And that's been very successful. We've been getting a lot of people taking advantage of that, and it's hopefully a win-win. That's what we're hoping anyway. And we've had really positive feedback. I did that when we were judging in Olathe, and it was very successful there. And so I thought that might be a good thing to do here as well. We do have some very inquisitive people that will come up with scenarios that we are often challenged to find out how we want to answer the question. But it's been a lot of fun. So that's been going well. The other thing briefly again is we're looking at, as a city, in decriminalizing our parking. So that's something that there's a lot of energy going into right now. And we're trying to kind of look at the different ways that might work. And then again, there's a whole nother thing I could talk about with that, which I won't at this time.
We'll put them on the agenda another time once you get, because you guys are just starting the kind of the study process of that. I will send out, so the school supply drive for municipal court goes through August 20th. So I will attach that, all of these meeting documents, so the slides and everything will be attached back to the, they will be added on the CJCC website, but also attached to the meeting invitation. So if you guys have folks, staff, maybe you have parking things that could benefit from the school supply drive. There's a couple more weeks for that. So I'll make sure all of y'all have that information. And I did want to share, and I don't know if Suzanne wants to talk about this more. The DA's office did release, about a month ago, you completed your annual report. I will also kind of send a link to that just so folks have that. And then Suzanne and I are trying to figure out when a good time would be for her and her office to kind of share the highlights of that, but want to make sure that folks know that that is a thing that's out there too. I think that's everything. Okay.
Before we adjourn, do we have any public comment? Take public comment here in the hearing room first. There's no public comment. If we have any public comment online, please raise your hand on the Zoom function. I'm not seeing any hands raised. So with that, we're adjourned. Thank you all for coming today. Appreciate it.
And we are scheduled to meet next month too. In September. This will be weird meeting back to back for right now, trying to catch up.